So when you say ethnic issues, it's pretty obvious that Israel will be involved in it in a way. So that's why I want to focus on this issue, even though the report, especially 3.1, has managed to show a wider scale of events that are not just, I mean, that they don't derive just from ethnicity, but ethnicity is a very major factor. You can pass on to the next slide. Thank you. So we found that we are dealing in the past 20 years, maybe say 25 years. As you said, Stefan, we took a few years back in order to give it the proper context. So we discovered that there are two main threats. One of them is an old threat, or as we call it, the national conflict. A threat that is materialized, or we name it as, jihadist Islamic terrorism. The other threat is what we formed or named as Jewish terrorism. And I have to put a little star on that because there's a lot of dispute. There's a big dispute in the Israeli discourse whether to call it Jewish terrorism or not. Now, this is leading to the main, let's say, one of the most difficult problems to materialize de-radicalization, and it regards maybe to the former panel, that the state of Israel is refusing or have a problem with calling it, with connecting between Judaism and terrorism, ever since its establishment, there is a notion that terrorism can only be performed by Muslims/Palestinians. So to go further from this, that's why we decided to center more on the Jewish terrorism alongside the Palestinian one. So both of them go hand in hand because of the what we name as the main national conflict, which regards the dispute over territory and national identity between the Jewish state and the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian nationality, not yet to be a state. And we actually saw that it is more essential to elaborate on the Jewish terrorism since it defined itself as a self-response, as a counter-response to the Palestinian terrorism. You can move to the next slide, please. So, describing both threats, as I said, we mainly focused on Jewish terrorism since it can be identified as a new form of terrorism, but still the Palestinian ethno-religious based terrorism is something that always holds a threat against Israel, as we saw in recent events only last month. So we tried to collect the main things that connect or let's say defines what involves Palestinian ethno-religious terrorism. And we found that the main actors or the main stakeholders in this particular type of terrorism is performed by Hamas movement or Hamas organization, because since it's also a political party, and also by the Palestinian Jihad, which also operates at a very similar ideological notion, but in a little different way. And up on the north border of Israel, we also have a third organization that is also a political party named Hezbollah and operating in Syria and Lebanon. So the affinity of most people that take action or that take the ideas into action when talking about Palestinian jihadist terror usually is expressed by membership in Hamas movements, as Hamas is the larger movement of all three and the one that holds the main threat. So usually you can be either a member of the group or have some sort of ideological identification, or you may have any family relations with one of the members. And it was also found in the past, let's say 5 to 7 years, that most of the actions, even if we define them as lone wolf actions within the territory of Israel and the West Bank, is connected in some way or another to Hamas organization or to the Palestinian Jihad organization. To sum it up, we also, we came to the conclusion that radicalization with that term doesn't appear in empty space since it accompanied by Hamas political regime that started to act since 2006. You can move to the next slide. Now, the second part or the second threat is the Jewish ethno-religious based terrorism. We're talking about radical right-wing groups, a variety of groups, but we centralized in one that is existing in a disputed territory across the West Bank area. They oppose to any territorial compromise between Israel and the Palestinians. And they attack not only people that identify as Palestinians, but any person who is suspected to be Arab or Muslim, even if he is a citizen of Israel. Now, their influence is very, very wide. It doesn't come only from the historic conflict, but also from political movements and parties that recently managed to enter into the Israeli parliament, to made it through the threshold. So they're influenced by also political parties, regional rabbinic leaders. It means that rabbis that live in disputed areas and in, let's say, Jerusalem, which also holds a very big significance, also influence those people who commit Jewish terrorism, but also civic society movements as they define themselves. But as we saw it more correctly, ideological movements that are sustained by civilians that share the same notion with the political parties. Now, in this case as well, radicalization is, of course, connected to the national conflict, but also holds a bigger grasp in society discourse ever since Benjamin Netanyahu came into control, came to be prime minister back in 2009. To conclude everything, we saw that, of course, there is an obvious relation into the IGAP, I call it IGAP theory, but into the IGAP components. But they are also strongly attached to all kinds of historical, political, and sociological processes that are happening in Israeli society, which means it's not true to just say everything is involving the national conflict. It also involves gaps between periphery and center, also geography, demography, also holds a neoliberal economy and such. We also saw that the most significant or important issue that the Israeli regime should refer to if we're talking about radicalization is the lack of trust in the political regime, since we have had 4 different elections in the past couple of years. So the Israeli citizens, as well as the Palestinian Authority population, don't believe in their authorities, and there is lack of national solidarity to be united and maybe to prevent the next courses. And we also saw a very significant involvement in both sides, both in radicalization and de-radicalization of civic society movements or organizations that take in hand whatever they see that the country is not taking care of. And even in democratic terms, it's maybe good, it's very pluralistic, but it also regarding violent actions. So I just brought a quote from the report from D3.1 that we wrote it, we finished it in April, and then in May 2021, which means past months, we had a lot of riots occurring in mixed cities in Israel. Mixed cities means that Arabs or people that are not Jewish live in Jewish cities. I live in one of those cities, so I've experienced it myself. It was almost impossible to leave the house. And we saw that the riots occurred are the outcome of whatever we identified a month before. And that's one of the quotes. Listen to this. If the state does not solve its national ongoing conflict with the Palestinians, more youngsters, Jews and Arabs, might find themselves choosing inevitably a road of extremism and continue to challenge the state's monopoly over violence. And that's exactly what happened last month. Hopefully, with last night's results of the election, it might get a shift to a better future. Thank you.